The air inside the Fort Brooks training compound was thick with anticipation and gun oil. This wasn't just any ordinary drill. It was the annual precision shooting qualification, the one that determined who would stay on the elite Overwatch roster and who would be rotated out. For the snipers of Bravo team, every shot counted, and every name on the roster had been there for years. Every name, that is, except the one that just showed up on the assignment board that morning. Staff Sergeant Jack Monroe squinted at the digital tablet handed to him by the commanding officer. "You've got to be kidding," he muttered. Colonel Stevens didn't smile. "Orders from division. This is not optional. You're integrating a new shooter today." Monroe scanned the file. Sergeant Grace Taylor. Logistics? One tour? No team ops? The rest of the squad crowded around, eyebrows raised. Corporal Ben Carter let out a low whistle. "She's gonna slow us down." Private Torres, the team's wind reader, frowned. Why send someone like that? Today of all days. No one had an answer, but the tension in the prep room was suddenly as sharp as the edges on their rifle barrels. Then the door opened. In stepped a woman in standard issue fatigues, brown hair pinned tightly beneath her patrol cap, face unreadable. She didn't move like someone who knew she was unwelcome. She moved like someone with a purpose. "Sergeant Grace Taylor, reporting as ordered, sir," she said crisply, standing at attention. Colonel Stevens nodded. "Briefing in 20. Get your gear squared away." As she crossed the room, the others shifted aside just enough to signal she wasn't part of the circle. Grace said nothing. She simply sat down, opened her weapon kit, and began assembling her rifle. No special scopes, no custom grips, just standard issue everything. Monroe walked over, arms folded. "You familiar with advanced precision under stress?" "I'm a qualified marksman, staff sergeant," she answered evenly. "That's not what I asked. This isn't your standard range test. These are real-world conditions. Wind, movement, time pressure." "I understand." Her calm response only seemed to frustrate him more. He glanced at Carter. "She's your shadow today. Make sure she doesn't fall behind." Carter clearly wasn't thrilled but gave a tight nod. The rest of the team went back to their final prep, checking wind data, adjusting trigger pull settings, exchanging quiet jokes born of years spent in foxholes and forward outposts. Grace stayed quiet. She wasn't part of the banter. But she never missed a step. From across the room, Private Torres whispered to Carter, "She even know what a crosswind hold is." Carter smirked. "I give her until Station 4. She'll crack." Grace cleaned her rifle with the kind of discipline that only comes from long hours of repetition. No fidgeting, no wasted movement. And when she finished, she simply sat and watched the flags outside the window. Her eyes weren't nervous. They were calculating. The colonel called them to the digital course board, 12 stations. 4 minutes each. Variable wind, unpredictable targets. You know the standard, 88% team aggregate for elite status. Then he added weather's shifting, winds up to 20 miles per hour by midday. Adjust accordingly. Monroe laid out the rotation. "Carter, you're first. Then Torres, Diaz, Mew, and Taylor." He turned to Grace. "If you'd prefer alternate stations, less demanding positions, we can make that accommodation." "I'll stay on standard rotation," she said simply. Carter rolled his eyes. "Your funeral." Back in the prep area, the veterans were starting to show signs of nerves. Monroe kept double-checking his scope. Torres was pacing. Even Diaz, the team's calmest shooter, had started his deep, breathing routine. Grace, she sat still, eyes closed, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. No nerves, just readiness. No one noticed the photo tucked inside her gear bag. An old snapshot of a smiling man in uniform, standing beside a younger version of her brother. She touched it briefly, then sealed it back inside. "Final checks!" Monroe barked. "We're up in 5. The team filed out into the sunlight toward the course, each man shouldering years of experience and a healthy dose of doubt toward the woman at the back of the line. No one expected much from her. She was, after all, the last-minute add-on. A paper pusher from logistics. They didn't know her name would soon be the only one with a perfect score. But for now, all they knew was this: she was quiet. She was new, and they were sure, absolutely sure, she would slow them down. They had no idea how wrong they were. Grace Taylor didn't say a word. While the rest of Bravo team tightened their gear, rechecked scopes, and exchanged nervous glances. She quietly unpacked her government-issued rifle, the kind every recruit receives at basic. It had no upgraded optics, no ergonomic grips, no personal modifications, just steel powder and history, and her hands moved over it like a pianist returning to an old, familiar keyboard. Staff Sergeant Jack Monroe, who had trained with these men for years, watched from the corner of the prep bay, arms folded. He'd seen nervous rookies before, plenty of them. They fumbled, sweated, overcompensated. Grace did none of that. What unnerved him most was how calm she was. Across the room, Corporal Ben Carter whispered to Private Torres, "She's still using standard sights. No custom zero, no high dynamic reticle. Might as well show up with a slingshot." Torres chuckled. "Watch her freeze when the wind kicks in." They spoke just loud enough for Grace to hear, but she never looked up. She was adjusting the tension on her sling, reassembling the bolt, and checking the chamber. Each step exact, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Because she had. When the others ran through breathing drills, Grace simply sat still, breathing naturally, counting her heartbeats like her brother David once taught her. David had always said calm wasn't the absence of pressure, it was control under fire. The team didn't know that. They just saw a woman with quiet eyes and no reputation to her name. Carter tossed a rolled-up wind map onto the table. "Up to 22 meffin now. Great day to ruin a record. Don't overthink it," Monroe muttered, tightening the windage dial on his modified long-range scope. Grace quietly read the same wind data herself. She didn't comment, didn't guess. She simply adjusted. Slight shift to her left hand grip, slight compensation in stock alignment. She'd already factored in how a crosswind would affect a 7.62 NATO round at 900 yards. What she didn't factor in were the looks, the snickers, the isolation. That wasn't new. She had seen it before. In the Olympic circuit, when older male shooters dismissed her as a novelty. On base, when she requested a transfer to active deployment and was told, more than once, "You'd be better off behind a desk." But she didn't argue. She didn't complain. She never did. She just waited and prepared. Outside, the air grew sharper as wind swept across the valley, where the qualification course had been laid out like a sniper's crucible. 12 stations with variables shifting at every turn. Back in the staging room, Monroe gave the final rundown. No surprises. "Just stay in rotation and stick to what you've trained for. Carter, position 1. Then Torres, Diaz, me. Taylor, you're last." He turned to her with the faintest edge in his voice. "If you feel you need more time or guidance, speak up before we start." Grace met his eyes. "I'm ready, Staff Sergeant." No bravado, no tension, just steady certainty. The room went quiet. Diaz looked away. Even Torres couldn't find something smart to say. As they moved out to the field, Torres nudged Carter. "Still betting she chokes at Station 4. Carter grinned. "She'll fold before that." But she didn't. At the line, Grace waited patiently for her turn. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan the others. She simply stared downrange, calculating the physics of wind, motion, and time. A gust kicked up sand near the first barricade. Carter swore under his breath. He missed the first shot by 2 inches. 8 points. Torres followed, 9 points. Diaz held steady, 10. Then came Monroe, 10 again, barely. Now Grace stepped up. All eyes tracked her. She moved into position like she'd rehearsed the motion in sleep. Rifle steady, breath low. When the target appeared moving lateral at 250 yards in crosswind, she squeezed off a single round. "Mark, 10 points," the evaluator called out. Torres blinked. "Beginner's luck." Carter muttered, adjusting his sling with sudden frustration. Monroe didn't say anything, but he didn't look away from her either. Back at the staging tent between rotations, the mood began to shift, quietly, subtly. The jokes stopped, the snickers faded. Grace still didn't speak unless spoken to. She cleaned her rifle, checked her trajectory data, and reset her mental clock for the next shot. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to be ready. When they rotated to Station 3, heavy wind, double movement targets. Monroe pulled Diaz aside. "She doesn't flinch," he said. Diaz nodded slowly. "That's not normal. That's practiced." "You think she's been holding back?" Monroe asked. "Or hiding something?" Diaz answered. "Either way, she's not what we thought." Monroe looked toward Grace, who stood alone just outside the prep line. The same way she had stood at her brother's memorial weeks after he was killed in Syria. He didn't know that part yet. None of them did. All they knew right now was that she wasn't cracking. And if her silence unnerved them earlier, it was starting to do something else now. It was making them pay attention. The red light above the firing lane turned green. Bravo Team's annual precision test had begun. Staff Sergeant Jack Monroe stood at the edge of the range, scanning the setup. 12 firing stations stretched across a rocky valley, each with its own challenge: moving targets, shifting winds, variable terrain. Today's conditions were brutal. Gusts up to 25 miles per hour swept through the canyon, slapping flags sideways and sending grit across the shooters' faces. This wasn't a friendly competition. This was the qualification drill that decided who would remain on the elite Overwatch roster. There were no second chances. One mistake could cost you your spot and your team's deployment readiness. Carter was up first. He adjusted his stance, muttered something under his breath, and zeroed in on a human-shaped silhouette at 300 yards. The target shifted left. He fired. Center mass but low. 8 points. The evaluator called out, marking his digital pad. Next was Torres. His target dipped behind a barrier before emerging again. He rushed his shot. 9 points. Diaz followed. Smooth pull but overcorrected for wind. 10 but barely. Then Monroe. He took a breath, centered his reticle, and landed a clean hit. 10 points relief. Then it was Grace's turn. She stepped forward with quiet purpose. No hesitation. She moved like someone who wasn't impressed by the stress, or perhaps no longer burdened by it. The moving target slid into view, medium speed, left to right at 275 yards. Crosswind blowing hard. Most shooters would delay, or rush, or miss. Not Grace. She adjusted her cheek weld slightly, tracked the motion with the barrel for less than a second, then squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed once across the range. 10 points. Silence. Monroe blinked. Torres looked up, Carter's jaw set. That was rare, almost unheard of, on a moving target in these conditions. Beginner's luck, someone muttered under their breath. They moved to Station 2. The course didn't get easier. Smaller silhouettes, greater distance, increasing wind speeds. The team stayed steady, scores between 7 and 9. No one cracked. But no one was perfect, until Grace. Again, she stepped up. Again, she breathed once. Again, her round found center. 10 points. By Station 3, they were watching her openly. At Station 4, a notoriously difficult setup with dual moving targets at staggered ranges, Monroe miscalculated wind drift and dropped to 6 points. Carter fared worse. Even Diaz, usually the team's rock, missed one. The frustration began to show. Grace stepped into the same station, adjusted for the terrain, and fired. Once, then again. 10 points. 10 points. Torres stared wide-eyed. Who is she? The pattern continued. No matter the conditions, gusting winds, elevation shifts, unstable footing, Grace's shots never wavered. She didn't shoot fast. She didn't shoot showy. She just didn't miss. By the 5th station, the team's posture had changed. The shoulders that once angled away from her were now leaning slightly toward her. Not with camaraderie yet, but with growing curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, respect. At the 6th station, the most technically complex on the course, Grace hesitated for the first time. Not out of doubt, but out of calculation. The target was a 5-inch plate set at nearly first 200 yards in high crosswind. The flags snapped violently. Monroe hit off center. 8 points. Torres missed the first shot entirely. Grace adjusted her foot position slightly. Her breathing slowed. She waited. And then, crack. 10 points. Colonel Stevens, watching from the command booth, leaned forward slightly, making a note on his tablet. Monroe finally broke the silence during a short pause between stations. He walked over and said in a lower voice, "Sergeant Taylor, have you competed before?" Grace didn't blink. "Some experience, Staff Sergeant." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not military training." "No, sir." Before he could press further, the call for Station 7 came. This time, the targets moved unpredictably, changing direction mid-pattern. Even seasoned marksmen struggled to track and predict them. Carter missed one completely. 0. Torres barely clipped his 6. Monroe held his own. 9. Grace stepped up, exiled, and waited. The target dipped, shifted. Reversed, crack. 10 points. She turned and stepped back. Her face remained calm, But her grip on the rifle told another story. Quiet focus, channeled intensity. Monroe stared after her. "I've seen that before," he whispered to Diaz. "The way she absorbs recoil, that breathing control." "She's not from logistics," Diaz muttered. By Station 9, the whispers had stopped. No one mocked her anymore. No one doubted. The numbers were undeniable. She hadn't missed a single target. Jackson, who had dismissed her outright at the start, now stood behind her during setup, watching her hands. "How are you adjusting for the wind?" Grace didn't look back. "I'm watching the flags 2 stations ahead. Not where the wind is, where it will be when the round gets there." Jackson shook his head. "That's next level." The 10th station required unstable footing, simulating a mountainside perch. Most shooters hated it. Monroe stumbled during his shot, pulling wide. 7 points. Grace stepped up, dropped into firing position, and shifted her center of gravity into the slope. She fired once. 10 points. It wasn't just skill. It was something deeper. Poise under pressure, calculation, experience. By the end of Station 11, Monroe did the math in his head. She hadn't dropped a single point. No one in the unit's history had ever done that. Then came Station 12, the most difficult of them all. Combined stress, wind, motion, and a strict time constraint. Everyone missed, except her. When the final shot echoed across the range and the evaluator called out, 10 points, no one looked surprised anymore. They just looked stunned. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Colonel Stevens stepped forward and called for silence. "Qualification complete," he said. "Results will be announced shortly." But everyone already knew. Grace Taylor had done the impossible, and Bravo team, who once called her dead weight, had just watched a standard-issue rifle, in the hands of a quiet woman, rewrite their entire understanding of elite. By the time Bravo team reached the 9th firing station, the valley wind had shifted again. Unpredictable, sudden, and brutal. Private Diaz looked up at the wind flags, then back towards Sergeant Grace Taylor, who sat alone at the edge of the staging line, her eyes closed, breathing in a deep and steady rhythm. She wasn't meditating. She was preparing, measuring wind patterns, calculating bullet flight paths not just by sight, but by memory and intuition. "What's she watching?" Carter muttered, squinting at her. "Not the same thing we are," Diaz replied. The rest of the team was losing ground. The gusts had picked up dramatically, sending off even the best shooters by a few inches, more than enough to cost them elite qualification status. Carter missed wide again. Torres barely clipped a moving silhouette at 500 yards. Even Monroe, sharp, steady Monroe, scored an 8 at a station he'd aced every year. Then Grace stepped up. The flags were dancing in different directions, near and far, high and low. Most shooters would glance once or twice, adjust their scope, and pray. Not Grace. She studied the rhythm of the flags downrange like a conductor anticipating the swell of a symphony. Then, she made a slight adjustment to her rifle's cant, shifted her footing an inch to the left, and fired. Crack. 10 points. The evaluator called. Again. Staff Sergeant Monroe didn't say a word. Not yet. He just stood still for a moment, arms crossed, staring hard at her. Not with suspicion anymore, but with something far more unsettled. Recognition. Back at the tent during a scheduled rest period, Diaz leaned in beside him. "Sir, I've been thinking those shots. That kind of precision. It's not just military training. That's something else." Monroe nodded. "Yeah. I've seen a few expert shooters in my time, Diaz. And I've seen a lot of good ones buckle under pressure. But she's not just good. She's controlled. Tuned. Like she's been doing this for years under the highest stakes." Diaz frowned. But her file said logistics. 1 deployment. Admin, level clearance. She shouldn't even be here. And yet, Monroe muttered, she's the only one not missing. Back at Station 10, the challenge changed again. Unstable firing platform. High crosswind, moving silhouette target. Torres missed. Carter swore under his breath after landing a 6. Monroe fared better, 8 points. Not great, but acceptable. Grace stepped up last. She dropped to one knee, braced the butt of her rifle against her shoulder, not with textbook posture, but with intention. Her eyes tracked not the target, but the terrain behind it, the dust, the treetops, the way the wind swirled down the slope. And then, like it was nothing, crack. 10 points. Colonel Stevens had been watching from the command station since Station 3. Now he stood at the edge of the range, tablet in hand, brow furrowed. He turned slightly toward the senior evaluator and murmured, "Watch her grip. Look at that trigger pull. No hesitation. Zero overcorrection. Whoever trained her wasn't just military." The evaluator nodded silently. Monroe had had enough. During the next brief break, he walked up to her, his tone no longer confrontational, but cautious, almost respectful. "Sergeant Taylor," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "Yes?" "Staff Sergeant, that breathing technique you're using, that recoil control, the way you read the flags downrange, that's Olympic grade. Where did you learn that?" Grace hesitated. "Not long, but enough. I've trained in environments where wind played a major role," she answered carefully. Monroe narrowed his eyes. "Ever compete?" "A few times. Nothing recent." He tilted his head, still watching her. "You don't flinch. You don't second guess. You shoot like you've done this your entire life." Grace simply looked at him, not defensively, not arrogantly, just quiet and measured. "Staff Sergeant," she said gently, "it's not always about how many tours someone's had. Sometimes it's about what they've been through before they got here." The final 2 stations were coming up fast. The rest of the team had stopped placing bets. They weren't whispering anymore. Instead, they were watching her closely. Her body language, her breathing, even her foot placement. Carter leaned toward Torres. "That wasn't luck. That's muscle memory. Elite level." Torres nodded. "You think she's special ops? She's something," Carter replied. "But it ain't just military." "No way." At the 11th station, long-range snap shooting with time constraints, Grace didn't rush. She adjusted for wind, predicted the motion of the target, and fired with the kind of timing that bordered on supernatural. Crack. 10 points. And then again. Crack. 10 points? Monroe looked at Diaz, her scores still perfect. "That's not just shooting," Diaz said quietly. "That's discipline on another level." As they prepared for the 12th and final station, the hardest on the course, Colonel Stevens stepped forward, eyes on Monroe. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "I'd wager she's outscored the rest of the team combined." Monroe didn't argue. "Sir?" he asked carefully. "Who is she?" The colonel didn't answer. Yet, he simply replied, "Let's finish the test." And so, as the team took their final positions, with the winds at their worst and the pressure at its highest, Grace Taylor, the quiet woman from nowhere, braced herself for the last shot. They thought they were watching a logistics sergeant. They were really watching something else entirely, a master class in control. The final shot echoed like a punctuation mark across the valley. The evaluator lifted his tablet, stared at the numbers a moment longer than usual, and slowly looked up. "Qualification complete," he announced. Bravo team stood together, breathless. Dirt covered, wind battered, and quietly stunned. Not a word was spoken as they gathered their gear. Not even the usual post-range banter or low fives. What could they say? The math spoke louder than any of them ever had. Grace Taylor had not missed a single target. 12 stations, dozens of variables. Shifting winds, unstable footing, moving silhouettes. She had shot through it all with pinpoint precision. Not once had her score dropped below perfect. Staff Sergeant Monroe stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes still fixed on her. He'd run drills like this for over a decade. He'd served in Iraq, in Afghanistan, trained with the best snipers in the corps. He'd never seen anyone do what she just did, and she had done it with standard issue gear. No upgrades, no fanfare, no excuses. Just calm hands and a clear mind. Colonel Richard Stevens stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His expression was unreadable, but the tone of the moment shifted as soon as he spoke. "Before we conclude today's qualification, I have an announcement." The team straightened, instinctively sensing something unusual. "Today's exercise," Stevens continued, "served more than one purpose. Yes, it was your annual marksmanship qualification, but it was also a live assessment, an evaluation of this team's adaptability under uncertain conditions." He paused, then motioned to Grace. "Some of you may be wondering about Sergeant Taylor's background. I think it's time you knew." Grace stood silently, hands clasped behind her back. Sergeant Grace Taylor is not simply a transfer from logistics, the colonel said. She is a two-time Olympic gold medalist in precision rifle shooting. She holds 3 current world records, including one for shooting under extreme wind variables. Records that still haven't been broken. Mouths opened. Carter let out a low whistle. Diaz looked like he'd just been hit in the chest. She competed in Rio and Tokyo, Stevens added, and was headed for Paris when her older brother, Captain Daniel Taylor, was killed in action in Kandahar. The name hung in the air. Monroe felt his chest tighten. He was a combat medic decorated twice for valor. The colonel continued. After his death, Sergeant Taylor requested transfer to active duty, not to honor her brother with words, but with action. She completed combat training at the top of her class, set range records in Quantico, and passed the Overwatch integration program in record time. A long pause. Her assignment to your team is permanent. The colonel's voice was steady, but the message was clear. This wasn't a test of her alone. It was a test of them, whether this tight-knit, seasoned squad could recognize excellence, even when it didn't arrive in a package they expected. Monroe swallowed hard. Torres was staring at the ground, jaw clenched. Carter was red in the face, clearly embarrassed. And Grace was still composed, until the colonel added. She requested no special treatment, no mention of her past, no headlines, just a fair shot. And for the first time all day her voice caught, just barely. As the colonel dismissed them, the team stood frozen for a beat too long. Then, slowly, they began to move. Monroe stepped forward first. Sergeant Taylor. She turned toward him, meeting his gaze evenly. I owe you an apology. That's not necessary, Staff Sergeant. Yes, Monroe said quietly. Who'd is? He cleared his throat. We made assumptions. We judged you before we ever saw you shoot. And I was wrong. Grace didn't flinch, but something softened in her voice. In my experience, Staff Sergeant, apologies matter less than what happens next. Monroe gave a nod. Then let's start next the right way. One by one the others followed. Diaz walked up, extended a hand. Your brother would have been proud today. Carter, sheepish, muttered, for the record, I'm never doubting logistics again. Torres offered a quiet, Mom, and nodded. That was as much as he ever said. And just like that, the walls began to fall. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the Colorado mountains, the team sat together around the long metal table in the wrecked tent, debriefing, joking, passing coffee, like they'd known each other for years. But the atmosphere was different now. Lighter, warmer. Rio and Tokyo. Diaz asked, incredulous. And I thought passing airborne school was impressive. Grace gave a modest smile. Shooting targets that don't shoot back is a different kind of pressure. What made you leave all that behind? Monroe asked gently. She looked down for a moment. My brother used to say that protecting people was more important than podiums. After he was killed, I just didn't care about medals anymore. They all went quiet. Then Carter said softly, Head be proud, you know. You didn't just honor him today. You saved our whole team's reputation. Grace smiled for the first time all day. Not a small smile, but something real. Thank you. Back at the command office, Colonel Stevens made one final note in his log before closing the tablet. Monroe, still standing nearby, turned to him. Sir, if I may ask, why didn't you just tell us who she was from the beginning? Stevens looked up, voice low and firm. Because, Staff Sergeant, there are no labels in the field, no resumes, just performance. I needed to know if your team could see past a uniform and spot the real talent standing in front of them. Monroe gave a slow nod. Understood? Sir. Good, the colonel said. Because Sergeant Grace Taylor isn't just another shooter. She might just be the most valuable asset this unit has ever had. And outside, under a sky streaked with twilight, Grace walked alone back to the barracks, rifle slung over her shoulder. Not as an outsider. Not anymore. Now she belonged. That night, the air at Fort Brooks felt different. Bravo team had gathered around the table in the mess hall, a place normally reserved for quiet meals and light jokes. But tonight, the conversation was more subdued, more thoughtful. The metal coffee urn hissed in the corner. No one was laughing. No one was teasing, not like before. And sitting at the far end of the table, her posture still composed, was Sergeant Grace Taylor, No longer the outsider, no longer the question mark. She had become something else entirely. She was the one who had rewritten the rules. And now, the men who once whispered doubts behind her back were taking turns standing in front of her. Staff Sergeant Jack Monroe was the first to rise. He cleared his throat and set down his coffee cup. "I've been leading this team for 6 years," he began, "and I've seen all kinds of shooters. Good ones, confident ones. Some who looked great on paper and crumbled under pressure. But what I saw today," he paused, struggling to find the words. "I've never seen anyone do what you just did." "Not once, not ever." Grace didn't interrupt. She didn't shift in her seat. She just listened, the way someone listens when they've heard doubt before, but are still gracious enough to let you speak. "I misjudged you," Monroe admitted. "I looked at your file and saw what I expected to see, not what was there. And for that, I'm sorry." He nodded once, not expecting forgiveness, but offering his own accountability. Grace met his eyes. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." But it wasn't over yet. Corporal Ben Carter, usually the loudest voice in the room, stood next. He said, scratching the back of his neck. "I've always run my mouth before my brain caught up. And I said some things yesterday I regret." He looked down for a moment, then back up at her. "I thought I had you pegged. Logistics girl with a basic rifle. I figured you'd fold at the first gust of wind. But what you did out there," he shook his head, "that was surgical. That was something I didn't think possible." He hesitated, then added, "I was wrong. And I'm man enough to say it." Grace offered a faint but sincere smile. That kind of honesty means something. Diaz didn't say much. He simply walked over and extended his hand. "Your brother would be proud, Sergeant," he said softly. Grace took his hand and nodded. "I hope so." Torres, normally skeptical of everything, was the last to speak. He walked up, cleared his throat, then paused for so long Monroe started to wonder if he'd changed his mind. "I used to think instincts mattered more than training," Torres began. "Now I realize, when you've got both, you become something the rest of us can only learn from." He looked her in the eye. "You taught me something out there. I won't forget it." Grace didn't gloat. She didn't take a victory lap. She simply said the one thing that needed to be said. "Apologies matter less than adaptation," she told them. "The question is, what happens now?" And that was it. That sentence landed like a stone in still water. It rippled through every man at that table, reshaping the room, the mood, the team. Grace Taylor wasn't just forgiven. She was accepted. Later that evening, Monroe found himself walking a quiet path just outside the barracks, the cold night air settling over the trees like a heavy blanket. He wasn't alone for long. Footsteps crunched behind him. "Grace, mind if I walk with you?" she asked. "Not at all," he replied. For a few moments, they said nothing, just walked. The gravel shifting underfoot, the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the dark. "I didn't want to make today about me," she said at last. "I know," Monroe replied. "And that's part of what made it work." They paused near the flagpole, the stars stretching wide overhead. "I've seen shooters burn out under pressure," Monroe said. "But you didn't even flinch." Grace shrugged slightly. "I've spent a long time learning how to breathe when it matters most." "Your brother teach you that?" She nodded. "He taught me that breathing isn't just about oxygen. It's about control, intent, staying human even when things get ugly." Monroe looked at her. Not as a subordinate, not even as a soldier, but as someone who had already lived through what most people couldn't name. "You're going to change the way this team works," he said quietly. Grace smiled. "I don't want to change anything. I just want to help us do what we do better." The next morning, things were different. Subtle but real. When Grace entered the tactical briefing room, no one ignored her. No one shifted away. Diaz offered her a seat next to him. Torres passed her a printed map without a word. Carter asked her opinion on wind corrections before the briefing even started. Respect had arrived, not with applause, but with eye contact, with questions, with inclusion. Monroe stood at the front of the room, cleared his throat, and began. "We're going wheels up in 70, 2 hours for a live Overwatch operation. Mountain terrain, high wind, high risk. Civilian structures nearby. That means zero margin for error. He turned to Grace. Sergeant Taylor will be our primary shooter. I'll be her spotter. No one flinched. No one objected, because now they understood. And so, as Bravo team entered a new phase of their mission readiness, one thing had become crystal clear. The woman they had once doubted wasn't a burden. She was their standard. She wasn't here to prove anything anymore. She was here to lead, and this time nobody questioned it. Not even once. 3 days after the qualification drill that had stunned Bravo team and rewritten their understanding of what one person could do, Colonel Richard Stevens stood at the front of the operations room, hands behind his back, eyes sweeping over the assembled soldiers. The reason that qualification was so critical, he began, is because you're deploying in 72 hours. A quiet shift moved through the team. The colonel tapped a digital pad. Behind him, a large screen lit up with the satellite image of a mountainous region. Steep ridges, tight valleys, and narrow extraction zones. This is Operation Sentinel, he said. An intelligence officer has been wounded and stranded in contested territory near Echo Ridge. He holds data too valuable to fall into the wrong hands. Your job is to provide overwatch for the extraction team. He turned towards Staff Sergeant Monroe. Given the terrain and the level of precision required, I'm assigning Sergeant Grace Taylor as your primary shooter. Monroe nodded without hesitation. Yes, sir. You'll serve as her spotter. The rest of the team will provide perimeter security and support. There were no objections, not this time. No sideways glances. No questions about her background. Because now they knew who Grace Taylor really was and what she could do. Back in the tactical room, the team gathered around the mission table. Maps and topographical models spread out across its surface. Grace stood at the far end, already marking elevations and wind corridors, adjusting variables in her head. She didn't need to be asked. She had already started building a firing plan. We'll be operating at around 8,200 feet, she explained using a laser pointer on the digital map. Thinner air will affect bullet drop, less drag, flatter trajectory. But the crosswinds through this saddle here, she pointed to a narrow ridge, will kick the round left if we don't calculate drift ahead of time. That's the window the exfil chopper will fly through. Diaz nodded slowly, taking notes. You've seen conditions like that before. In competition, yes, Grace said. In combat, not yet, but the physics stay the same. She turned to Monroe. I'll need accurate wind telemetry from downrange. 2 spotter inputs, if possible, elevation and valley floor. I'll cover the ridge, Torres said quickly. I can rig a wind scope and relay back. I'll anchor the base route, Diaz added. Plenty of cover down low? Good, Grace said. Then we're building the shot in 3 dimensions. That's the only way to protect the approach corridor. Her calm matter-of-fact tone set the pace. Later, out at the range, the team wasn't just practicing. They were absorbing. Grace now coached them. She watched Carter's grip and shook her head. Your trigger reset is costing you milliseconds. Try rolling the pad of your finger instead of pulling from the joint. He adjusted, fired, and looked through the scope. Tighter, he muttered. A lot tighter. Diaz was next. She repositioned his stock alignment by half an inch. You're fighting the recoil instead of working with it. He tried again, and immediately saw the results. Where'd you learn all this? He asked between shots. Grace offered a soft smile. I've been chasing perfection for a long time. Monroe watched from a few yards away. It was hard to believe that less than a week ago they had dismissed her as a liability. Now they were looking to her, relying on her, not just for firepower, but for leadership. Technical, composed, unshakable. That night, they shared their final meal before deployment. Tradition in Bravo team meant every soldier shared something personal around the table. Something not in the file. Torres went first. My grandmother still thinks I work at a warehouse. Can't bring myself to tell her otherwise. Carter followed. I was studying music before I enlisted. Played piano. Still do when I can sneak in time. Monroe leaned back in his chair. When I was a private, I got pulled out of a bad ambush by an Overwatch team just like this. That's why I signed up for this unit. I wanted to be that help for someone else. Then it was Grace's turn. She looked at the group, quiet for a moment. My brother and I grew up shooting cans off fence posts in Kansas. He went Army, I went Olympic. She paused. After he was killed in action, none of my medals felt like they meant anything anymore. No one interrupted. Grace's voice didn't shake, but her eyes softened. I wanted to do something that mattered to him. Something real. So I traded podiums for this. And if I get the chance to save lives the way he once did, that's a trade I'd make every time. Torres spoke softly. He'd be proud. Grace nodded. He always said military shooting was harder than competition. I think I'm about to find out if he was right. At 0400 the next morning, they loaded into the C-130 transport bound for the forward operating base. By 1300, they had hiked 6 miles up unforgiving terrain, reaching the overwatch point above Echo Ridge. The air was thin. The wind whistled hard through the pines. But Grace moved like she'd trained here her whole life. She set up her rifle beside Monroe, scanning the valley through her scope. Winds rotating out of the northeast, she said, stronger than forecasted. I'll need eyes on both flanks, already posted. Monroe confirmed, tapping his earpiece. Diaz and Torres are in position. The extraction team was inbound in under 30 minutes. Grace exhaled slowly. It's time. From doubt to respect to reliance. This wasn't a drill anymore. And in less than half an hour, they would find out what happened when the quiet woman with the perfect aim went to war for real. Dawn broke over Echo Ridge in thin, fractured light. The mountain air was sharp, the kind that cut right through layers of gear and bone. From the overwatch nest, Sergeant Grace Taylor lay prone, cheek pressed gently against the stock of her rifle, scope trained down the valley. At her side, Staff Sergeant Monroe adjusted the spotting scope. They'd been in position for over an hour now. Diaz and Torres held perimeter positions on lower flanks, relaying wind data every 3 minutes. The rest of Bravo team was spread across the ridge, watching for movement. The extraction helicopter was 15 minutes out. Grace's heartbeat stayed slow, her breath smooth. She felt no different than she had on the competition firing line in Tokyo. Except this time, missing wasn't just a loss of points. It meant people would die. Target zone active. Torres' voice crackled through the comms. 6 hostiles on the north slope. Armed. Scanning the ridge but not alert yet. Monroe confirmed through his own scope. I see them. Pattern suggests routine patrol. They're not expecting us. Grace adjusted her elevation dial 2 clicks. Distance. 1,300 yards. Wind pushing 10 to 15 from left to right, Monroe replied. Grace did the math automatically. Her eye remained glued to the glass. Below, the hostile unit fanned out lazily, until one broke from the pack, heading up a rock formation with a shoulder-mounted tube. Possible RPG, Torres said sharply. Climbing for high ground, confirmed. Monroe said, tone tightening. He's tracking the approach corridor. Grace didn't wait. Request permission to engage, she said, already aligning the reticle. Green light, came Monroe's voice. Grace inhaled, slow and controlled, then exhaled halfway and paused. She didn't pull the trigger. She let the rifle fire. Crack through Monroe's scope, the hostile dropped instantly. One shot, one clean impact. Target neutralized. Monroe confirmed. Movement, Diaz reported. Others are reacting. 2 heading toward a covered position with clear line of fire on the landing zone. Grace reloaded, shifted slightly, tracked. Crack. Crack. 2 down, Monroe said. Flawless. A moment passed, then a third figure darted from behind a boulder, aiming toward the ridgeline. Grace adjusted for wind again. This gust was inconsistent, snapping flags hard at the valley mouth. She ignored them and focused on the more distant tree line. There, crack. Another one down. Torres whispered. That's 4 in under 30 seconds. The whoomp of rotor blades grew louder in the distance. Extraction bird 1 minute out, Diaz called. Monroe spoke quickly into the comms. Remaining hostiles moving toward landing zone. Possible ambush in 10 seconds. Grace already had them sighted. The lead was tight. They moved like they'd rehearsed this. She waited not for movement, but for the right timing. Crack. 1 down. Second adjusted his position. Crack. Gone. Silence returned to the valley, except for the chopping of helicopter blades. Approach is clear, Monroe said. All threats neutralized. Through the dust and dawn light, the Blackhawk settled on the narrow landing zone. Team Bravo's extraction unit sprinted out, retrieved the wounded intelligence officer, and loaded him in seconds flat. Then they were airborne again, climbing hard and fast away from the zone of fire. At the Overwatch nest, Monroe finally lowered the spotting scope. He looked at Grace. "That was the most impressive shooting I've ever seen," he said. She didn't look up. She was already scanning the terrain behind them. "We need to move before reinforcements arrive." There was no pride in her voice. No celebration, only clarity. They hiked back through jagged terrain in tight formation. Grace moved like water between the rocks, low, silent, aware. By the time they reached the forward operating base, word of the operation had already preceded them. Colonel Stevens was waiting by the landing pad. "Packages secure," Monroe reported. "No team casualties. All enemy threats neutralized before exfil." The colonel nodded, then turned to Grace. "Command reviewed the helmet cam footage," he said. 5 confirmed kills. All single shot, all at extreme range under high wind variables. He paused, then added, "Your performance will be added to the Special Operations Training Library." Grace offered only a quiet, "Yes, sir." Back in the team tent, the mood was hushed, but this time it wasn't tension. It was something closer to awe. Carter set down his gear and walked over to her. "You saved a dozen lives out there," he said. "Including mine?" Diaz nodded. "That wasn't just textbook. That was something else." Torres added, "We've seen good shooters. You're beyond that." Grace didn't respond right away. She sat on the edge of her cot, rifle across her lap, wiping dust from the barrel. "I just did what I was trained to do," she said at last. But Monroe shook his head. "No," he said. "You did more than that. You showed us what it looks like when instinct, skill, and discipline work as one. That's not training. That's a gift." Outside, the wind continued to rush through the pines. Inside the tent, Bravo team, once skeptical, once dismissive, now knew exactly who Grace Taylor was. Not just the quiet one. Not just the Olympic shooter. She was the reason they were all still breathing. And from that moment forward, they would follow her anywhere. 6 days after the operation in Echo Ridge, the official commendations came through. Staff Sergeant Monroe read the first line out loud in the briefing tent. "By unanimous recommendation of command, Bravo team is hereby selected for integration into Tier 2 Advanced Special Operations Training, effective immediately." A quiet stir moved through the room. That kind of selection wasn't routine. It was reserved for units that had not only proven themselves under pressure, but had demonstrated an ability to evolve under fire. To adapt when the old rules no longer applied, and the catalyst for that evolution sat quietly in the back of the room, cleaning the dust from her sling. Sergeant Grace Taylor. Colonel Stevens made it official that afternoon. "In light of your performance," he said to the assembled team, "Command is adopting elements of your Overwatch protocol into the next phase of precision training. Specifically, Sergeant Taylor's wind tracking methodology, target anticipation timing, and her discipline under fire." He turned toward Grace. "Your helmet cam footage from Operation Sentinel is now part of the Elite Marksman training curriculum at Fort Benning in Quantico. Congratulations, Sergeant. You've become a case study." Grace didn't react with a smile or a shake of the head. She simply nodded once and said, "If it helps others come home safe, I'm glad." Over the next few weeks, something rare happened at Fort Brooks. Bravo team wasn't just training, they were being studied. New recruits came in to observe. Advanced candidates sat quietly in the back of the range during Grace's dry runs, notebooks in hand, watching how she shifted her weight by inches, how she let her breath settle before every shot. Some asked to work with her directly. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't used to being the one people came to for answers. But slowly, Grace found her voice. Not the one used behind a podium, but the one used from one shooter to another. "Don't fight the wind," she told a young corporal one morning. "Use it." The recruit blinked. "Use it?" Grace knelt beside her, pointing to the flag's downrange. "It's not just what it's doing right now," she said. "It's what it's going to be doing by the time your round gets there. Trust your instincts more. That's what makes the difference. When the math stops working." The corporal adjusted her posture, fired again, and hit dead center. 6 months passed. Winter turned to spring, And by then, Fort Brooks had changed. Grace Taylor's name was now on the instructor wall, right alongside the longest-serving veterans. Not because of her years, but because of what she gave back. She wasn't loud. She didn't run group drills with barked orders. Instead, she pulled aside the ones who had potential but lacked confidence. The ones who reminded her of herself when she first walked in that room, carrying a standard issue rifle and 1,000 invisible assumptions on her shoulders. "Your breathing's tight," she said to a young private named Jennings one afternoon. He adjusted his grip. "I keep trying to slow it down." Grace shook her head. "Don't slow it down. Listen to it. Match your rhythm to your body, not the clock." She handed him a notebook from her pack. Inside were sketches of elevation diagrams, bullet drop curves, even side notes about how temperature affects drag coefficient. "My brother and I wrote this when we were teenagers," she said. "Before he deployed, before I ever wore this uniform." Jennings flipped through it like it was sacred text. "You ever miss him?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled, the kind that came from a place deep and still aching. "Every day," she said. "But I think he'd be proud of what we're building here." Monroe watched it all unfold from the sidelines. The team was tighter now, more aware, more deliberate. Carter had dropped his sarcasm by half, focused more on refining his groupings. Diaz had taken over as secondary instructor. Even Torres, who once thought instincts couldn't be taught, was now helping train wind correction under live conditions. And Grace, she had become their center. One afternoon, Colonel Stevens joined Monroe on the range, watching Grace work with a pair of new recruits. "You remember how this started?" the colonel asked. "Like it was yesterday," Monroe replied. "She walked into our team room with a clean rifle and no reputation. And now," Monroe smiled, "now she's leading the future." The colonel nodded. "Sometimes the most valuable soldiers aren't the loudest," he said. "They're the ones who walk in, change everything, and never ask for credit." Later that day, Grace stood alone by the observation hill overlooking the target valley. Her rifle rested beside her, but she wasn't training. She was remembering. She pulled out a photo, worn at the corners, from the side pocket of her pack. Her brother Daniel, smiling in uniform, arms slung around her shoulder, back before medals or missions or war. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Why settled it, didn't we?" And for the first time in months, she let herself smile, fully. Some victories don't come with applause. Some don't even come with recognition. But they matter just the same. Because they echo, in the lives saved, the futures shaped, and in the quiet clarity of knowing she didn't just earn her place. She built one for others to follow. It was quiet again at Fort Brooks. 6 months after the Echo Ridge operation, the base had settled into its usual rhythm. Recruits came and went. Brass gave speeches. New units rotated through. But some things had changed in ways only a few people noticed. At the far end of the firing range, beneath the long shadows of the pines, a small brass plaque had been installed. No ceremony, no trumpet fanfare, just 4 words etched clean into the metal. Every shot meant something. Beneath it, the name Sgt. Grace Taylor, Olympic gold medalist, Overwatch 39 Bravo. On that particular morning, Grace walked the range alone. She wasn't there to shoot. Her rifle was still in the case slung over her shoulder, unopened. She simply walked, slow and steady, taking in the terrain like one revisits an old memory. At Station 6, the platform she'd built herself after hours of training others, she paused. It had been a long journey from the day she first walked into Bravo Team's briefing room. Back then, no one had known her name. No one had asked where she came from. Some had dismissed her. Some had doubted her. But now they came to her for guidance. Young soldiers who once struggled with breath control or wind calls now walked away with confidence in their fingers and clarity in their eyes. All because she'd taken the time to teach them not just how to shoot, but how to believe in what they were capable of. Inside the main building, her image hung quietly on a training wall, a still shot from Echo Ridge, face focused behind the scope, wind flags whipping in the background. Underneath, a single quote: "Trust your instincts more. That's what makes the difference." Cadets passed that photo every morning on their way to the range. Some nodded at it. Some tapped it for luck. None of them knew the full story. Not really. But that was fine with Grace. She hadn't done it to be remembered. She'd done it to remember him. Later that afternoon, back in the barracks, Grace opened the side pocket of her field pack and pulled out the photo. Edges curled now, colors faded slightly. Her brother Daniel, grinning in uniform, son behind him, arm around her teenage shoulders, his silver star ribbon visible, crooked as always. He'd worn it proudly, but never let it define him. You know, she whispered to the empty room, we never did settle the argument. She smiled. He had always said his combat medals mattered more than Olympic gold. She'd teased him, told him he was just jealous of the ceremony, the crowds, the podium lights. And then he was gone. And suddenly, none of that had seemed important anymore. Grace stood and walked outside, past the armory and down to the shooting bay, where a young specialist was struggling to group shots inside a 4-inch ring. Try shifting your weight to your back leg, Grace offered gently. The soldier jumped slightly, then looked up. Oh, Sergeant Taylor, I didn't see you there. That's kind of the point, she smiled. He tried the adjustment. His next shot landed tight, nearly center. He grinned. That's way better. Remember that feeling, she said. That's your instinct working. He nodded, but then asked, almost shyly, did you always know you'd be good at this? Grace considered the question for a moment. No, she said. I just knew I had to be. That night, as the sun dropped behind the Colorado ridgeline, Grace returned to her quarters. The day had been long, training, mentoring, helping a newer instructor adjust her curriculum. But as always, she took a moment to sit by the small desk near the window. She placed the photo of her brother upright, brushed some invisible dust from its frame, and rested her hand on its edge. The moonlight caught the corner of her rifle case, leaned against the wall, worn from years of use but still reliable, just like her. She closed her eyes. No medals, no parades, no fanfare, just the quiet knowledge that people were alive because she had stayed calm, focused, ready. Because when the moment had come, she didn't need to raise her voice. She only needed to raise her rifle. Then, almost inaudibly, she whispered the words she'd never said out loud before. Some medals don't come with ceremonies, but they mean more than gold. And in that still room, with no one else around, that truth settled into the air like a benediction. Some people change the world by being loud. Some do it by being seen, but the rarest few. They do it by showing up when no one expects them to, by staying steady when others break, by teaching, not preaching, by proving, through actions alone, what real strength looks like. Grace Taylor never asked to be a symbol. She only asked for the chance to serve. And in doing so, she became something more than a soldier, more than a legend, more than a name on a plaque. She became the quiet answer to every unspoken doubt. The proof that being underestimated is sometimes your greatest advantage, and the reminder that the most valuable medals are the ones earned when no one is watching. Sometimes the loudest voices in the room aren't the wisest. Sometimes the strongest hands aren't the ones that make the biggest noise. And sometimes the most heroic souls wear no medals, because they were too busy saving lives to wait for applause. Sergeant Grace Taylor's story reminds us that true worth isn't always recognized at first glance. It's proven in moments of quiet resolve under pressure, when no one is watching and no one expects you to succeed. Her calm under fire, her refusal to break when judged, her choice to lead with action rather than ego, those aren't just military traits, they're human virtues. And they matter. Whether you're in uniform, in a hospital, behind a desk, or simply trying to be heard in a world that often values volume over substance. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you're not enough, or if you've carried a skill, a truth, a strength that others failed to see, this story is for you. You don't need to prove yourself with noise. Let your actions do the talking. And when the moment comes, be ready to rise. What about you? Have you ever had to prove someone wrong by doing what no one thought you could? Share your story in the comments. We read every one. If this story moved you, if you believe quiet strength still matters, hit subscribe. There are more stories like Grace's waiting to be told. Because some medals don't come with ceremonies, but they change lives all the same.